So why do I focus so much on intersectionality and identity? Not only for the reasons that I just laid out, the importance of breaking down identity to understand how are we all pieced together, each individual puzzle pieced together. Because eventually that's then used to, okay, how do each of our individual puzzles fit into the grander puzzle of life existence and human cooperation, interaction, collaboration, all those types of things that are important to specifically the work that I do in the nonprofit world and advocacy is, how do we achieve a common goal and a common cause? You can't just skip over individual lived experiences and expect people to get along, because that's the minute you do that, you skip the individual experience and the individual stories. That is when a movement gets into immediate trouble, because then you have people fighting because they don't understand each other, they talk past each other, and I see that a lot even in social justice circles that I'm in. Luckily this isn't on video because but so that's why I always start with intersectionality, identity as the first steps, and in movement building, in building camaraderie between folks within a single room. Obviously I don't really have time to do that in this workshop or presentation, but for me, that's why I started with a question. Are you MWPA members? Or are you all writers? Are you all live in Portland? Things like that, because obviously there's the point where questions can be a little evasive, like the question that we all struggle with as Mainers is, where are you from? But there can be too much attention on sort of like what are the intentions behind and the impact of that phrase, but there's also the piece of it as Mainers, we're just kind of curious about what brought you to this space. And so being very judicious about when to use that phrase, I think is super important, but also realizing that humans are by nature curious and they want to know who are they engaging with. And when they know who they're engaging with, it's easier to then do that engagement piece, to spend time together, to do things together. That's why I always harp and always start off with intersectionality and identity, is to realize that we're all, each one of us, complex people. We all have our own experiences, things that we bring to the table. And that's just more of a riff on why getting people to think outside of our own existences, to think how we're all interconnected and complex and interconnected is so important to me. So I'm going to read a little bit from my book at the end as sort of a thank you for coming. But very simply, there are the 5 questions that we often include when we're planning for anything. And I've had to plan an event in 2 weeks, and so I feel like this has been my life. The who, what, where, when, why, and how. I think that's 6 questions. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on the who and the what, and then I'll go a little bit into the how, but not too much, because I think the who and the what are the substance pieces of any story, of any narrative, of any kind of writing. The who was very important to me because if you were to ask me in 2012 or 2010, Marpheen, who are you? I wouldn't have had a straight answer. Well, because I'm gay. So, no straight answer there. And I had my own little coming out journey. People think it's sort of a one and done thing, where you just come out and everything's happy, everything's go lucky, and everyone throws you a little party, and your friends, celebrate you and then matchmake you, and you find your forever love. But I came out when I was about to turn 19, starting at USM, had a very good summer, made a new friend group in my first year at USM, went to a Lady Gaga rally against Don't Ask, Don't Tell, fired up, went back to campus, helped start the U.S. Career Straight Alliance. But if you were to fast forward to later that spring when I came home in rural Maine and was staying with my parents again, you know, very Christian, our house, our rules. Before it was no girls allowed at all. As a 19-year-old, about to turn 20-year-old, living at home during the summer, now it was, okay, no guys or girls at the house. And so I had a little bit of a delayed rebellion where I went out to the parties, went out to hang with friends, and one of the parties I went to in Bridgeton or Harrison, there was a group of guys there that also went to USM, and they looked at me and they whispered, or I think they said, 'cause you know, young guys, they said it so that I would intentionally overhear. But essentially, it's like, oh, it's the president of the queers, and the mood just changed in that room. And I knew I was the only out queer person in that party, bonfire. And I remember having to go into the house and sit on the couch and just be alone. And so it was that period of time that I'd spent a year at college very out, very like forward about my sexuality and making friends, all types of things, to then sinking into sort of this like, I don't know how to do this in a place like this, place at home. And I carried that into my sophomore year at USM. And you know, had joined a fraternity and was very sort of, to my fraternity brothers, I use the word fraternity very lightly because it was mostly a social fraternity. But like all college kids, we like to have fun, but we didn't have a house, so we couldn't do those types of things. But I roomed with 3 other fraternity brothers, and one of the really messed up things that I did, mind you, after my first year of spending out very much out of the closet, was I would have one of my friends over who's a girl, and we would watch movies and talk and gossip and all those types of things. And then when she would leave, the 4 fraternity brothers that were living in that dorm suite would be like, "Oh, Marpheen, he got some action with a girl." And I was like, I didn't outright say, "Yeah, I did," but I didn't deny it either. And for me, to me, thinking about it now, was pretty messed up. But also, the turbulence and the experience that I was having in reaction to that experience at that party during that summer. And so, that's why I say, I didn't have my story straight back then. And I think it's sort of a discredit to human existence to ask anyone to have their story straight. And so for this question, for who, I'm not asking you, get your story straight or perfect. What I ask when I say who, especially when I was writing, it's like a few different questions. Who am I? Who was I before? Who was I as a middle schooler, as a high schooler, in these, especially in Memoir, when I was writing about consecutively about my experience. Who was I at these very different points of time? Who I am now in the present, and then I think important for any memoir is who am I becoming? Not to steal a word from Michelle Obama's book. And I think in writing about multifaceted human experiences, it's important to get at least some of the thoughts around the question of who, at least the questions formulated. Again, not forcing yourself to have all the answers, but at least having the questions formulated, because those questions, those reflections, become the story, the writing, and it becomes the struggle that you share with other folks who are also asking the same questions. And sometimes I fear in the society that we live in today, we're often not forced to ask those questions out loud. Who am I in this space, in this world, in this community? Instead, it's so focused on like, envision the person you want to be and just go for it. Pick the ideal model of a person or a leader or the author that you want to emulate, and just try to be them. And skip the question of like, well, who are you?
Yeah.
Like, you know, what is your place in the world? And what keeps you rooted where you are? And that was probably the most important thing about writing my story, was like, I was very hesitant about, because some people will look at it and they'll say, oh, it's ego. Or you know, in the spaces that I run, it's like, oh, it's identity politics. You shouldn't do any of that. You should focus on issues. You should just talk about how you need to pass this living wage ordinance or this living wage policy because it's just the right thing to do. But the problem with that kind of movement building or social change is you don't build the story that connects people who would probably disagree at first with that certain policy. I think you're getting an idea of where my politics is right now. But I think you know where I'm getting at is, rather than beating people over the head, it's like, this is just the right thing to do. Just do it. Just jump on board, support what I support. It's a very different thing when you say, here's why I believe a living wage is important. You know, I grew up in a very poor refugee family with mental health issues, food stamps, housing insecurity. Had we had a living wage then, it would have helped. Not completely, because my mom was dealing with some health issues, but it would have helped to at least solve some of her problems, where she wouldn't have to keep worrying about money on top of her mental health issues, on top of the domestic violence that she's experiencing from the many men that came through her life. And you see how the tune changes? You're more likely to be open to the idea of a living wage rather than just me coming up to you and being like, I'm a kid with a law degree and a college degree, and I think this is important, so you should support it. So that's also why I dig into identity and to who I am. So figuring these questions out, I think in America is a very hard thing to do because we are not asked to do it very often. And I think it's a little bit easier if you're less connected to technology and social media, because in social media, like I tell the teenagers that I often, I don't do as much educating as I do mentoring, is online social media, you're being constantly told who to be rather than being asked the questions of who do you want to be, how do you see yourself. And so in writing a memoir, in any writing where it involves your story and your experiences, always have this question is, you know, who am I when you're sitting down to write in a coffee shop or at home at your writing desk, or you're out sitting on a bench in the middle of you know, Evergreen Cemetery. Getting into the practice of even in that moment, even if you're not writing something that's narrative or that's memoir or related, but asking a question, who am I in this little bubble, this space, on this park bench, sitting in this coffee shop? And it's important to do that for me, because then not only am I tying myself to the present, kind of grounding myself, but it also gives me a window into why am I writing this particular thing. For instance, if I'm writing a poem about heartbreak, which I've experienced recently, asking myself, who am I in this space right now, keeps me tethered to some sense of reality. So then in some ways it also helps me not to spiral into too much despair about having a broken heart, because it also reminds me of where I've been and how far I've come. And in the reflections that I've had while thinking about heartbreak in this particular moment, with this poem and thinking about who I am, it's like, okay, in the grand scheme of it all, the totality of who I am and the experience I've had, this one heartbreak, yes, it hurts like hell, but I can get through it because I've been through so much already. So that's a reason why it's been important for me to center myself into who am I in a particular space in a particular time. And so that's just one way that I practice asking myself, who am I? Who have I become? And who am I becoming? And so that's just a way to ground yourself into what the elements of the story, elements of the memoir might be. The other question is the what. And this is very tied into the who questions, but what is the story you tell yourself about yourself? I don't remember the exact episode. It was on NPR, but it was essentially the voice, the internal voice you have. I think someone said that it's like a voice from a particular age that you have that you're talking to yourself in. But I think, that aside, I think it's important to figure out what's the story and the narrative you're telling yourself about yourself. And for me, that was a loaded question as I was beginning to write this, because, again, I didn't have my stories, quote unquote, straight. I didn't know who I was. Things were up in the air. And to know that in some ways the story I was telling myself about myself was a way of keeping myself accountable to reality and to who I actually was, and to not lie to myself. I think that's the most important thing about writing personal narrative or memoir is, I think humans by nature can pick up on when a person is lying and lying to themselves or about themselves. And so as you're writing personal narrative or memoir, asking that question, what is the story I'm telling myself about myself? And figure out, okay, am I telling a lie to myself about myself? Fibbing that, for me is like more of a white lie, I guess, is like, even the term I can get through this or I can muddle through is sort of a little lie you're telling yourself about yourself. And really doesn't really help you get through a particular issue. And so by squarely facing, I'm having a hard time dealing with this issue because of particular trauma or particular experiences, and I need to recognize that this is a weakness that I have, rather than saying I just need to smile through it or muddle through it, rather than telling myself that I'm stronger than I actually am. And we know in America, in toxic positive culture, we're often told to just think positive. Does us a disservice by basically lying to ourselves that we're stronger than we actually are, because when you think you're stronger than you actually are, you won't exercise and build strengths in the areas that you need to do to work on to be able to manage a certain situation. So in writing, in building that strength of writing personal narrative, writing about yourself, writing in a way that conveys well to others, authenticity, honesty, accountability to yourself bleeds into the writing and the pages and is picked up by the reader. And that's why I think a lot of people tend to pick up on the fact that they say that the book is conversational, they can relate to it, and then someone said, your writing changed over the course of the memoir, and we could really tell that you were struggling with an issue and having a conversation with yourself internally about that struggle. And in today's world where we want to skip the hard work and skip to a result and an outcome, and see a deliverable or something concrete, and totally glazing over that journey of stumbles and falls and areas of also of opportunity and growth and overcoming obstacles. I think that when we skip that whole piece of being honest to ourselves, we miss half the story. Because I think a part of any story is, my editor, for instance, Jenny Morgan, she's like, people don't just want to see where you started and then all of a sudden get fast forward to where you're like successful, you're graduated and got a law degree, all those types of things. Like, people want to see the ups and downs in between. They want to see the drama, they want to see the tears, they want to see the anger, they want to see the pissed off Marpheen, they want to see the super sad emo Marpheen in middle school and high school listening to Green Day and all that type of stuff. They want to like get a window into, okay, how did Marpheen make it from point A to point B to point C, not just from point A to C. And so that's why this question is super important, because when you get around to being honest about yourself and the story that you're telling yourself, then you start to pick up on the areas of improvement, and areas of struggle, and areas of what I would like to say is the areas that make the story. There was a series called Myths and Monsters on Netflix, which goes into the basics of why did Homer's Odyssey, it's Homer, right? Why did the Odyssey become such a big thing? It's because it had these specific elements of a hero, and in a way we're all heroes of our own story, where it wasn't just like this hero won, victory. It's like origin story, sort of a mini climax, sort of like a triumph, but then a fall or a conflict that then leads that person to go into the wilderness, the desert, the mountains, somewhere obscure, to then do a lot of self-reflection, and then they come back, and then that's when the real sort of climactic building begins. And so in many ways, pulling from that, how do you write an odyssey about yourself or your story, and it has to include the darkest moments as well as the highest peaks, and also some of the middle stuff too, right? The stuff that isn't as glossy or as punchy or as bright or vibrant, but little things that also make up the human experience as well, because you don't want to do toxic positivity where you have the reader just sort of like, this is great and it's always going to be great, or you don't want them completely depressed the entire time. So having those sort of they're not mediocre, but those neutral anchors, like I went to the coffee shop to get a cup of coffee, can be an anchor for people because it's something familiar. And then on top of that, you can weave in, there's very rude person who didn't know how to parallel park and ran over my foot or something. So that can be the climax of the story, or maybe when you fight with that person. But that sort of neutral anchor of like, I was just at a coffee shop. trying to do my own thing. So that's a little bit about what is the story you want to tell yourself about yourself. And then the last two questions I want to kind of loop together is, what is the story you tell others about yourself, and what is the story that you want to tell ultimately? And that's where you can see that these two can converge. Sorry, what you tell yourself about yourself and what you tell others about yourself can be two totally different stories, or they can be the same, depending on how much you lie to yourself. But the story that you tell others about yourself is also very key in how you write personal narrative, because it can be harder to pick up on the lies that you tell yourself about yourself. But I think we're all keenly aware to some degree of some of the white lies and the fibs that or omissions when we're telling stories to other people about our experiences and self. And I think in personal narrative memoir, it's important that not only do you stop lying to yourself or fibbing to yourself. Lying might be a little bit of a harsh word. But making sure that you're not also taking the reader for a loop or trying to give them a false impression. So again, authenticity, honesty, and reflection are super important, which then all feeds into what is the story you want to tell. Had someone asked me when I first started writing, what is the story you want to tell people, I would have really been like, oh, just how I became the person who I am, from a success standpoint. Like, how did I make it to become the first of my Cambodian and adopted families to graduate college and law school? How did I get involved in community organizing and social justice? How did I ran for office and got elected? Had you asked me like 2014, 2015, 2016, especially during the Trump years, why I was writing this book, that's probably what I would have said. Is because I was still very much in the frame of mind where it's like, what is my place in this world? Especially after the 2016 election when, like many other people, I was sort of kind of politically depressed. And I was like, what is my place in this climate? And then it became something very different when I took a little bit more time and thought about what I was writing a little bit more. And it became less about, here's my story of how I ended up here today in the present. And it became more about my very human experience with the triumphs and the falls and the trauma, the anger, the sadness, and not only of my own little story, but as you can probably tell if you've read the book and are going to read the book, weaving in the stories of my family members and the key people in the transitional periods of my life. What I also do is I offer a model. I offer a model to people of how do we exist in a politically divided world like today. And the model is, how do I look into another person's, try to peer through their perspective, try to think about the context of their actions and that might have led them to believing a certain way. And so for me, the story was, sure, growing up in an evangelical household as a closeted gay teen at the time, awful, right? And a lot of people would, if that was just a story, would walk away and take away, these parents were absolute a-holes. I wish I was Marpheen's parent, because then I would, love the hell out of him and make him come out. But that's not the story. The story that I ended up wanting to tell was, through my life, there were these particular folks who had a very big impact on my life. And so, in looking at my adopted family, yes, the evangelical world was super toxic, super harmful for me. But then I also told the story of, and my mom, my adopted mom, very, not OCD, but had a very tough upbringing herself. Her father was kicked out of the house when they were kids, single mother household, tight on money, maybe food insecure, I don't know. And so for me, I could have just left it as my mom was just overbearing and kind of a control freak, and people would have that impression of her. But I told the story of my family of how did my parents become such ardent evangelicals and so very conservative. And in that, weave this story of how they had lived a very different lifestyle before 1994, 1992, I think, or 5, where, they were part of a biker gang, drugs, alcohol, partying, and God and the church was what they needed to flip the switch off. And for me, the struggle is, well, if they hadn't done that, then they wouldn't have ended up adopting us. And so for me, weaving that story in, even though it's my memoir, it's my personal narrative, weaving that story in then gives the reader sort of a model or a practice of okay, maybe I need to look at this a little bit differently and try to understand from their perspective of why they're just so sometimes annoyingly evangelical and always, they don't proselytize as much, because I think they've gotten the point for me that I don't really appreciate that. And so for me, the story becomes, okay, I don't have to accept their belief system or give a total pass to their lifestyle and their belief system. But what I can do is that I can acknowledge it and then figure out, okay, how do I coexist so that we can continue being a family, we can continue showing up at dinners and whatnot. And so one of the stories that I tell is when I first came out, lots of fights, arguments, loud ones. They simmered down to sort of a little Cold War over the years, where no one wanted to talk about me being gay or anything remotely close. To then, particularly with my mom, which I had a rough relationship with in high school, somewhere along the road, my mom made a comment like, college was good for the both of us. You went away, you became an adult, and we were less in each other's hair, and now we get along better. So then a few years later, when I was sitting in the kitchen, and mind you, the Cold War, not talking about the gay thing, my mom was the one that walked in and was like, hey, how's your boyfriend? And they're not in the space where they're going to pride parades or openly supportive of LGBTQ rights and equality, and they're not probably accepting of it even now, but at least they are comfortable enough to have a conversation about it. And that's what became the story is, okay, from my life experiences and from the story that I weaved, the stories that I weaved in, I have learned to give some space and respect for time to work its magic. Rather than beating my parents over the head, like, you need to be on my side of LGBTQ rights, or I'm going to cut you off. We're not going to be a family because I don't feel safe in this household. And this isn't for everyone. But for me, constantly showing up and constantly being, to the best of my ability, who I am, got them to sort of back off. And then it got us to a point where, okay, now we can talk about it a little bit. And then in that talking about it, in that engaging, like I mentioned earlier, engaging, figuring out that we both sides have their stories. In that engagement is when I can show them, actually what you think about gay people is not correct. Like, you know, when I was a kid, I was taught gay people were miserable, didn't have God, were unsuccessful, and couldn't have families and all those types of things. They can look around, they can see the progress that's happened, but it's not going to have as much of an impact on them as having their own adopted son who is gay, make it in this world, eventually have a family, all those types of things. So that's the story that I ended up telling through my book, is not only self-discovery and figure out who I am, but then who am I in the context of the world I live in, where it is politically divided. It is difficult to exist and to find commonality, and to find bridges to build and to cross. And for me, not telling that story in such a positive, toxic positive way where it's just like, just build a bridge and people walk across it, just build it and people will come. Explaining that journey of like, okay, I was really mad about this at this particular point in time. I was really hurt by that thing my mom said or my dad said. And then taking them through the years, okay, how did that change? How did our two approaches change? How did my approach change? And then finally, here's this little glimmer of hope, this little glimmer of light. Like, I think my story in its totality has this bright sort of kind of ending. I wouldn't say ending because I haven't died yet, but has sort of this arc that where you know where it's going to end up, but it's how I weaved through that journey that makes that ending all the more impactful and leaves the reader with a lesson that they can take away. It's like, if Marpheen can do it with this set of experiences and this family and that family, and then, you know, I can do it with my intrusive, overbearing aunt who's always coming over about this particular China dish or something. I don't know, making stuff up. So that's what I mean by, what is the story you want to tell? For me, it was, yes, my story, super important. How do I get from a refugee family to being successful? The problem with that is everyone's kind of telling that story. Those self-help books, those mass print books in Walmart of like those people, just Dr. Phil's and all of them. It's like, here's how I overcame my experience and became a success. My story isn't about success, which again can be very market driven and driven by our society. It's about how do we find a way to coexist, and how do we change hearts and minds, and being very realistic that doesn't happen overnight. And that's a story that I really wanted to tell, that I found out I really wanted to tell. It didn't take a year for my parents to change their minds, and they still haven't changed their minds, but they've shown progress. So figure out that overall ending point, that overall goal, and overarching lesson that you want for people to take away, I think is what makes a story like mine or like yours, and gives you that overall anchor to always come back to when you're telling many different pieces of your story, or working in your many different identities and experiences in particular areas. And I'll be honest, I didn't have that anchor figured out when I first started writing, but that anchor really became is what helped me then go back and edit along with my editor. and to bring certain areas into light. Maybe get rid of the little monologue in the middle of just like me being really preachy. There's a lot of those, and my editor was very blunt about that, and so there were some very preachy sections that added to my word count, mind you, and made my book probably an extra 20 to 30 pages longer. But again, that anchor of like, what is the actual story I want to tell? And who do I want to welcome in to the space that I'm sharing with them through my words? And it cut deeply that I had to cut out so many extra words, but it all ended up making sense by the time that, you know, people were coming to me with comments about the story. So I think I have one more slide before I go to questions. How? Very quickly, again, I'm more focused on the who and the what. The how is just very simple advice. You can find out space, both physical airspace, also the universe space. Not only that, but time is super important in how I write and think about things. So take your time and pace yourselves. Because in that time that you spend reflecting, that really is where the gems of a story can come out. And in this world where it's, you know, I mean, if you want to be a Stephen King, be a Stephen King. Like, pumping out books every year. He's got his little formula going. But personal narrative and memoir is very different, where it has to find a way of connecting with the reader. And that takes time to figure out what pieces of my experience can connect to someone. Self-care. I'm glad it took 8 years to write this thing. So it was like writing for 2 months, very like consistently, taking a little bit of a 4-month break, 5-month break, sometimes half a year. But a lot of it involved me talking with my grandmother, my biological family, going back and talking through an experience. And then walking away with sometimes an affirmation that that's what happened. Sometimes walking away with like, I had that totally wrong. I wasn't 16 years old, I was actually 12. Things like that. So self-care, time and pacing yourself allows for that natural fact-checking to happen. And like I said, loss of reflection. In spending some time reflecting on a particular piece of writing or a thought or an experience helps to bring that more to life. And when that piece of writing and experience, when there's more time spent reflecting on it, that shows up in the actual final product, final writing piece, because that life that basically it's like a coloring book page, where, you know, as you spend more time with it, you fill it in with more colors. And so so a lot of the how for me was just a lot of time, a lot of reflecting, and a lot of self-care, because a lot of the issues that I deal with are traumatic, and even some of the memories that I processed and kind of like compressed and, you know, dealt with, the fact that I had to go back and kind of open it up again, like the wound and the scar are still there, so you're kind of, you know, not opening it up for complete damage again. So that's why self-care is important, so that you don't do that. But it's sort of like, okay, there's a little bit of a numbness here, a little bit of a catharsis, and so let's write about that, Marpheen. Let's like, why are you feeling so cathartic thinking about this particular thing, and why is it making you feel a certain way? And that takes a little bit of self-care. So that's like a little bit of the how. The where and the when, I'll leave it to you and to someone else who has some advice on that. But I wanted to open up for questions, and I think you had a question. Yeah. We'll spend some time answering questions, so. But any questions? I'll give you all some time to reflect on it.
Yeah. Wow, is what's kind of going. I was thinking